We started off with a panel that was very different from the others. This was the only panel that mixed scholars with people who had participated in the historical process. And we chose civil rights as this opening. And I think this was especially important because the National Endowment for the Humanities, which provided a substantial portion of the funding for the conference, has done a lot of work both with film and with written scholarship on the civil rights movement. They've funded a series of films that they've packaged that have become actually very influential on public television. But one of the interesting things is why we decided to do this. And as I recall, that was something that from the very beginning you wanted to do, was to open this not just with scholars.
I think it was really important for us to recognize a couple of things. That a lot of the scholarship that has shaped this field of African American history was tied to the civil rights movement. We're tied to freedom movement. So I wanted to make sure that people understood that the civil rights movement was transformative in many ways. And one of the ways was stimulating new scholarship, giving people new ways to understand the African American experience and the American experience. But the other thing was, it was crucially important to realize that the scholars are shaped by the movement, but also those who were involved in the civil rights movement were shaped by the scholarly questions that were being raised. So we really wanted to say that it wasn't a simple either or, that this was a kind of nuanced way to understand both the civil rights movement and understand the role of scholarship in that.
And it was especially interesting when we were formulating that session that this was one instance where we could even find scholars who had also been participants in the historical process, that so many historians had actually been active in the civil rights movement. And so we were able to get this kind of mix, which I think ended up being especially interesting.
I think it was really important for us to recognize that there were scholars who could personalize this experience, who could help people understand that the civil rights movement wasn't something distant, but really something that shaped their life, they were active participants in, and it allowed scholars to suddenly ask new questions about race, about gender, about fairness. So it really, in some ways, helped to illuminate how historians change and how historians are shaped by the broader society they work in. The other thing that I thought was so important was to be able to use this conversation to broaden the definition of what the civil rights movement was, to help people understand that despite all the surveys we did that people kept saying to us when we were building the museum, civil rights was going to happen. Change was going to happen automatically. To be able to help people understand how this is part of a long struggle, that wasn't a linear march to progress, but that it was a march that had sort of great starts and great stops, great victories and great defeats. And I think in a way, what was so exciting to me was while we focused on that post-war period, we also gave people an understanding of how this was not in isolation. And that in essence, what you hope the public got from this is what is a commitment to change and how long it takes to help America live up to its stated ideals.
And I think what worked especially well in that context was integrating a young activist into that conversation with these historians who both understood the past as historians and had participated in that long process that you've just described.
And I think having younger scholars, younger activists who actually helped us see where Black Lives Matter comes out of this, but where it diverges from that, really helps people understand that there's not a simple path to progress. But what there is a lot of different ways to change America.
Good evening. Boy, I'm so glad to see you all. I'm Lonnie Bunch. I'm the director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. I am so pleased to welcome you here. This has been a long, long journey, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the Smithsonian and to really the next couple of days that I know will be ripe with robust debate, discussion, scholarship. In many ways, this is the first step of the opening of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Because when we planned this, the vision was that you were going to get to be inside the building, right? That you were going to get this sneak preview of the newest museum of the Smithsonian. But I got to tell you, if any of you have ever remodeled your kitchen or put an extension on your house, the one thing you know is that you can give 15 win one for the Gipper speeches and implore them to do better, but construction takes its own pace. But the one thing I do know that I can guarantee you is that on September 24th, President Obama will cut the ribbon and open the National Museum of African American History and Culture. We may not be ready on the 23rd, but we're ready on the 24th. I got to tell you, in any event of this magnitude, there are so many people to thank, and I will spare you of the long list. But I think that in many ways, my staff and the fact that we are in the grand opening year, we are so proud to join with the American Historical Association, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the organization History in organizing and supporting this conference, The Future of the African American Past. Now, this conference evolved from conversations I had with Jim Grossman, the executive director of the AHA. And as you know, we talked a lot about how this would be an appropriate time to actually look at the state of African American history and to really build on the work that was done in Purdue in the 1980s, to really think about how has the field changed and what does it mean today and what are the future directions. But I have to be honest, it's always risky to work with a close friend like Jim. But the wonderful thing about Jim Grossman is that everything he touches has been made better. And Jim, let me thank you. Because of you, this is a much better conference, Jim. So thank you so much. And we are also so indebted to the National Endowment for the Humanities and Bro Adams. I mean, in some ways, we all know that for decades, the NEH has supported the amazing research and scholarship that has helped us really understand and enrich our understanding of the African American experience. And for those of us that work in museums and film and the like, NEA has been the go-to place to support so many of the products that have made the best scholarship accessible to the public. So I thank so much Bro Adams and the NEH for what you've done. And I also want to mention how much we appreciate the support of History, the group that was, I hate to say it, formerly known as the History Channel, but they have done so much to increase the visibility of history. And I think that their support means a great deal to us as we move forward. And obviously, because we're not in our building, I want to thank the National Museum of the American Indian for hosting us today, and for the National Museum of American History, who will host us tomorrow and Saturday, for being flexible, which is something the Smithsonian is not known for. But there's a lot of work that goes into this kind of conference. And while people like Jim Grossman and I get to stand in front, the reality is this conference was really made possible because of two people who were the glue, who provided the nimbleness, and who provided the discipline that made this conference possible. There's no doubt that without Dana Schaefer of the AHA and Deirdre Cross of the museum, we wouldn't be here. Deirdre, Dana, where are you? Where are you? Take your bow. There they go. And those of you that have received their emails over and over again know how good they are. This morning, I got a call from a reporter who wanted to know, why would the museum, at a time when it was focused on opening the building, why would the museum even help to organize such a conference? Well, the simple answer is that we're crazy. But the real answer is that at the Smithsonian, at this museum, scholarship is the engine and research is the lifeblood of the institution. Without the decades of research and academic scholarship as a foundation, there would be no National Museum of African American History and Culture. So we know that we are tied so much to the work that so many of you do. So much of the intellectual and interpretive agenda of the museum has been shaped by the work of many who are participating in this conference. Thanks to this amazing array of scholarship, the museum is able to position itself as an institution that will help all who visit find a rich, complex, and nuanced history of the African American community. But even more importantly, thanks to your work, this museum will recenter the African American experience and use African American history and culture as a lens to understand what it means to be an American, so that the audiences who visit will realize how much America's identity and aspirations have been profoundly shaped by this history, by this culture, and this because of you. Since the Purdue Conference, the field of African American history and culture has expanded and morphed so many times. As such, there are so many issues, so many topics, so many themes that it was impossible to do everything in this conference. And there are so many gifted scholars whose voices should be heard, but who can't for this particular conference. It says, I think, so much about the vibrancy, the importance, the expansive nature of the field of African American history, that no single conference can hold it all. But we are so excited about this conference because we're excited about the array of scholars who are gathered here. And in some ways, as I see Deirdre Cross of my staff saying, okay, Lonnie, stop talking, let me begin the conference by introducing the moderator of tonight's roundtable, The Long Struggle for Civil Rights and Black Freedom, Barbara Ramsbury. Barbara is a dear friend who's a professor of history and African American studies as well as gender and women's studies at the University of Illinois. A student of the Black Freedom Movement and a longtime activist, she has been a close observer of and participant in the Black Lives Matter movement, of which she is currently writing a book on the movement's origins. Her work is well known. We've all reveled in the biographies that she has written, and I want to tell you how honored and pleased we are. So please join me in welcoming a great friend and colleague, Barbara Ramsbury.
We've invited the whole panel to join us here for the roundtable. What a lovely audience. Thank you all for coming out this evening. I want to start off this evening, this roundtable, by thanking Lonnie Bunch. He thanked a lot of people, and I echo those thanks. It takes a lot to put on a conference like this and get a lot of very busy people in one place at one time. But I also want to thank and acknowledge Lonnie for what has been a decade-long labor of love. You know, he was in Chicago before, so we loaned him to this project. But it has been a decade of hard work and struggle and maybe some surprises along the way. And I'm sure as we stand on the threshold of the opening of this historic new institution, this powerful institution, that none of us will be disappointed. And so thank you, Lonnie, to you and your staff and to all the hard work that is making what we are anticipating possible. I also want to invite all of you here tonight to come to the next 2 days, because as I look out at the audience, I can't see all the faces, but I know they're there. Some of the most prominent and distinguished historians are in this audience, people who have made time to be here for this conference, who will present papers in the next 2 days. And so tonight is really the warm-up act for the next 2 days. So please come back and participate in the discussion and the debate, and you will not be disappointed. What I want to say tonight is, by way of introduction, is that while we want to give the past its due, We also want to give appropriate attention to what Dr. King called the fierce urgency of now. We have an extraordinary roundtable of panelists. Their bios are in your program, and maybe you've seen them on your website, so I'm not going to give extensive introductions. But suffice to say, there is a vast wealth of wisdom on this panel, both scholarly and experiential, from Terrence Roberts, who was one of the Little Rock Nine, who marched into Little Rock Central High School in 1957 and made history, to the youngest member of our panel, Jessica Pierce, who is a fierce and formidable organizer with the Black Youth Project 100 and has organized direct actions all over this country, and we expect her to be a part of that cohort to change the world. And in between, we have three extraordinarily prominent historians: Clay Carson from Stanford University, Sarah Evans, Professor Emerita, University of Minnesota, and Rosalind Terborg Penn, also Professor Emerita from Morgan State University. So join me in welcoming the roundtable participants. I did not select this panel, but I could not have selected a better group of people to start this conversation about the long civil rights movement. And as Jim Grossman told me the selection process, this represents a group of people who not only have thought and written and reflected about the civil rights and Black freedom struggle, but who in very concrete ways have been a part of and whose work has been influenced in very intimate ways by the movements of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So I'm going to start with a question, and we're going to have a back and forth. And they know this question, so I'm not surprising them with it. So don't, think they're coming up with these great, succinct answers on their feet.
They know these questions.
But the question is simply this. What was your entry into the movement? Tell us, what was the most powerful set of events? What were the circumstances under which you entered into the work related to the Black freedom movement, either as a scholar or as an activist? Some of you have written about this. Clay has written about this in some of the work that he's done. So maybe we'll start with you, Clay.
Well, for me, it started right here. I mean, literally right here on this street. Because when I was 19 years old, I came to the March on Washington. And that was my first demonstration. And I thought that they were all going to be like that. And so the movement was a very good thing to be in. And one of the things, though, that I think puts that in context is that a few days before coming here, I had met Stokely Carmichael at a student conference. Then he was a senior at Howard. And he introduced me to something that I really didn't know too much about. And so I'd like to make a distinction between what we might call the civil rights movement, which kind of culminated with the March on Washington, the passage of the Civil Rights Act of '64 and the Voting Rights Act of '65, with what I might call the freedom struggle. And what I remember I told him I was going to try to get to the march, and he kind of derided that. Why would you want to go to that Washington picnic when you can really join the movement? And he started talking about what they were doing in the Deep South and in the Delta of Mississippi and all of that. And I didn't have enough nerve to tell him that just going to the march was the most courageous political thing I'd done in my life. And going to these places would have been beyond that. And a few months later, I met, I didn't meet, I heard Bob Moses giving a talk about plans for the Mississippi, I think it was a meeting in New Orleans, plans for the Mississippi summer. And again, I kind of had this sense that beyond the movement that, like I grew up reading in the newspaper about you. And, and it was in, the Little Rock Nine were my heroes. That was the movement that I saw out there. But I think when I met Stokely and Bob Moses, I realized that there was something deeper, and that there were people in the movement who were not seeking civil rights legislation and would not be satisfied with civil rights bills, and understood that from their perspective, Martin Luther King they were not following Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King was following them, that they were in the vanguard of the movement. And I think that realization has shaped everything I've done since then, because that's what I tried to join, a freedom struggle. That's what my first book was about that freedom struggle. And I think today, just to kind of set up this discussion, it seems like the passage of civil rights legislation made so many Americans complacent, because the people at the center of the struggle understood that their job was the same the day after the Voting Rights Act as it was before the Voting Rights Act. And that they were in a struggle that was going to go on for a long... I just recently talked to Willie Ricks, that some of you might recognize that name, the person who first started using the term Black Power. And for him, this has been a 50-year experience in his life, and for so many other people like that. And I think that that's for the generation coming up. I hope that they connect to that.
Now, it's interesting to hear you remember yourself all those years ago and being impressed with Stokely and so forth. I remember once we were on a panel, this was also many years ago, and you said, as you got older, you remember, what I'm going to say? As you got older, King got wiser. Any decades after reflections about that moment of sort of seeing the juxtaposition of the rising Black Power movement and Kwame Ture and those folks juxtaposed to, against King, and maybe now seeing King in a different light?
Well, certainly one of the things I found out is that one of the things that made as many differences as there was between King and SNCC, they agreed on one thing, that the movement was about much more fundamental things than passage of civil rights acts. I think that King, the way I teach him now, is that Rosa Parks sent him on a detour, a 10-year detour, that he was a social gospel minister who wanted to, I found this one paper that he wrote in 1948 where he talks about his mission as a minister was to deal with unemployment, slums, economic insecurity. And look what he was doing in 1968. So his civil rights part of his life, as his career as a civil rights leader, was a major part of his adult life, but it wasn't the whole of it. And I think that for young people going back and looking at what were the ideas coming out of this freedom struggle, and what was King's vision of what he was about, and I think that there's a lot of commonality there.
Sarah Evans, what story do you want to tell us about your entry into the movement?
Right. Well, I have to say that my entry into the movement came primarily when I was an undergraduate at Duke University, and I was a bit player on the margins. But
don't downplay the bit players.
Yes, as the biographer of Ella Baker would have to say. My linkage goes way back because I'm a white Southerner. So I grew up in segregation, and my father had preached, the year before I was born, had preached a sermon criticizing the biological idea of race, using Paul and Acts, God has made all men of one blood, and ending the sermon with a critique of the white primary. Well, he was kicked out of that church. And that's why I was born in the parsonage in a little bitty town on the border of Georgia and South Carolina, which was kind of Siberia. I think I've always known it was about history. My mother told me sometime in early grade school, they're going to tell you in school that slavery was not the cause of the Civil War, but they are wrong. And I wish I could go back and ask her, how did she know that? I don't know. So it's very deep, and it's coming back up again now as I think our country is again understanding how deep racism goes, how embedded it is in so many of our ongoing daily relationships and structures, and that it's never has been simply about a couple of laws, but it's about how we live together. Mm-hmm. And and then, of course, the movement, I went to the Montgomery March at the culmination of Selma. That was my first really big one. And then I got involved in supporting a union at Duke because that's where the civil rights movement went. And out of my involvement in the New Left and anti-war and civil rights, I got involved in the women's movement. And that was when I went to my first group meeting in Chicago in the fall of '67. I hadn't realized how many northern white students went to Mississippi in summer '64. I didn't even know about Mississippi. They didn't recruit down white students in the South. I went to Africa that summer and had an extremely interracial experience laying bricks. But so that was my Mississippi experience. But at that point, the movement was my identity, and I feel like those movements together sent me to graduate school to study the history of women. And I've become, one of the things I am a scholar of is the ways those movements are linked together, and the way civil rights movement has been a template for other social movements that are about democracy.
I'm going to skip over Jessica. I know she has a lot to say about this, and not as far back to dig for her memories of entries into this work, and particularly you two sitting next to each other, because I think one of the things the Black Lives Matter movement and Black Youth Project 100 have done, despite the way that it gets presented sometimes, is to really foster some pretty amazing connections to labor struggles, to immigration struggles, to queer and trans struggles and so forth. So I want her to be able to talk about that. But I want to get the other memories from further back. No, I'm right there with you, sister.
I know. That's why I'm
Starting with the historians anyway.
But Rosalynn Terborg Penn, tell us a little bit about the early 60s, your NAACP work, and your troublemaking back then.
Well, I was a student at Queens College, it wasn't City University of New York then, it was just plain Queens College in the 60s. And as soon as I got there, there was movement. And there was a little stale group called the NAACP on campus. And not many black students at Queens in those days. But I did know them who were there and recruited them, and so we said, we really need to have a movement going, some kind of, and I don't know if we use the word movement, but we really need to become activists. We need to do some things. So that's what started me going. And then as I went home, and of course there's no campus there was no residential campus. So everybody went home at the end of the day. My father had been a student at NYU, but he had never talked about his early years there in the 1920s when things were not always too good. But he was there with Dorothy Height, and she was a troublemaker. And he used to say, "Oh, yeah, Dorothy, oh, yeah." So I knew that what I was doing, he understood because he had had some kind of dealing with it before. So that's what got me involved. Then we decided we were going to start being activists. So our first foray was to go to Woolworth's in support of the, by this time it's 1961 maybe, in support of the students at A&T who had gone to desegregate the lunch counters at isn't that awful? Greensboro.
Greensboro.
So we were going to support them. So we started boycotting the Woolworths on Fifth Avenue. Every weekend we'd go down there and we would march. And of course and it was marching in front of the building. We were not sitting at the counters. Or some people did, but most of us were outside. And they got the same kind of response in New York City as the people did in North Carolina. White America was not ready for this. You know, you needed to stay in your place. So we understood this. So we rallied, we did that, we got involved. By the time I was a senior, Andrew Goodman was a freshman. And I don't remember him that well, but I do know that we had started organizing students to be trained, because most of these were white Jewish students from New York City, Manhattan mainly, who had not had any interaction with black people. So I said, you really need to learn to know some black people before you just march into it. So I talked to the minister at the black Congregationalist church I belonged to in St. Albans, and I said, would you mind? He said, of course. Now, Andrew...
What's the rest of the sentence? Would you mind what?
Having
taking them in?
Bringing them in and introducing them to black life.
Okay.
At the time, Andrew Young and his wife were in New York, and they were coming to our church. So it wasn't like there was no civil rights thought in the congregation. So he had to go to the deacon board. My father was on the deacon board, and they agreed to let these students come in. So that's what started these Queens College students, to integrate them into a community where they could learn what black life was like and realize that it wasn't that much different than their lives. And from that was that summer of 60, and they went off. That following to Prince Edward County, Virginia. And so I thought that was important, that I was part of getting that together.
And it tells that part of the story, that the northern part of the story, you know, that the northern-based movement was.
And of course, the northern student movement developed shortly after that.
Sure, yeah. Terry Roberts, we want to hear about, we know the big picture. We have, you know, seen images of Little Rock and so forth, those very iconic images. But your family made a decision that you were going to be a part of that cohort of young people to be in that historic desegregation effort. Tell us about what that was like when you were a young man.
It actually started some years before. And I consider myself to have been conscripted into the Civil Rights Army on December 3rd, 1941. As I came charging out of the womb, I realized this was not the place that I had anticipated. So it took a while. I had to acquire certain skills. I had to learn how to speak. And eventually, I figured it out. In Little Rock, at the all-black high school, of which there was one, Negro history, as it was termed then, was a required course. I had heard about it even before I got there, but it intrigued me, and I began to find out, and I had to do this on my own because a lot of people I wanted to ask questions to were reluctant. Don't bring that up. Don't cause trouble. And I always was very curious about that response, don't cause trouble, because according to my estimate, the trouble was there before I arrived. But at any rate, I figured out that we were now, because in 1941 we actually were living under the aegis of the Plessy decision. See, the Plessy decision of 1896 didn't start anything. It was simply a codification of what had gone on before for hundreds of years. And all this information is just, I'm taking it in like a sponge. And then, as a 13-year-old, in 1954, when the court ruled in the Brown case, now here's an irony. In 1896, the Supreme Court said that it was constitutional to discriminate based on racial group membership. And yet, in 1954, this same court rules that it is no longer constitutional. I'm concerned about that. And maybe that's a question for some of you to deal with. For me, it was exciting, though, because the law was now on my side. I realized this. And my first thought was, I have got to model law-abiding behavior. So by volunteering to go to Central High School was an opportunity for me to model for others what was proper in this so-called law-abiding society, fiction or not. But in any case, we were more than 9 initially. We were probably 150 strong. We all went home on the day of making this decision to volunteer and informed our parents, at which time those numbers dwindled very quickly because of the great fear. There were rumors that if any of us decided to follow through with this, there would be blood flowing in the streets of Little Rock. And a lot of parents were not anxious to allow their kids to go. Now, the parents of the 9 of us were a bit different. And I think my own parents, I came home and told them I had volunteered. They responded by saying, we will support your decision 100%. And if you get up there and it's too hot and you want to quit, we will support your decision to quit 100%. So later on, I figured out I had the best of all worlds. I could stay there or leave without fear of losing one iota of parental esteem. That was wonderful. In fact, I used that in order to keep going day after day because life was not pleasant, to put it very mildly, at Central High School. We were there, the 9 of us, for 1 year. At the end of that year, the governor stepped in to close the schools. And most of you probably know this part of the story too. Orville Faubus, one of that pantheon, including Wallace. And what's his face? Maddox.
Yes, Lester.
Lester Maddox.
Lester Poleaxe Maddox. And of course, our good friend George. Well, all of them. But Faubus, he'd agonize over this whole thing. He didn't want black kids in the school because in his mind it was a white institution. During that summer of '58, between the start of the next school year, he came up with this brilliant idea to close all high schools in Little Rock, which he did as a ploy to keep black kids out. But the man wasn't bright enough to figure out that if you close the schools to keep the black kids out, you keep the white kids out too. Well, it's not really saying much that he wasn't bright, because in this country you don't have to have a measurable IQ to hold public office.
That's true.
It's pretty much.
That is so true.
But I was planning to go back for another round, but because of the school's closure, rather than languish there in Little Rock wondering what next, I simply relocated from Little Rock to Los Angeles, which was easy for me since I had relatives there who'd always promised refuge. It was not the case for a lot of my age group peers across racial lines, however. They didn't have those resources, and ergo they lost a year of school at the least, but they lost even more. And you were mentioning, Rosalind, Prince Edward County reminded me that in that county, schools were closed much longer.
Long time.
Much, much longer. And so it was that I now consider myself still an active soldier in this ongoing movement. And I don't see any end to it, unfortunately.
Right. I want to come back to some of what you've hinted at, particularly around the question of self-presentation and sort of representing yourself as the pinnacle of respectability. That was a strategy. at that moment, at that time, to accomplish something. And I think fast forward all these decades, the movement that Jessica is very much involved in has kind of taken a different tact and been very confrontational from the get-go. But you've had, before you were involved in the Black Youth Project 100, which started after the murder of Trayvon Martin in 2012, you had a history of organizing even before that. Do you want to talk about how you came into that and how you arrived at what you're doing now?
Yeah, absolutely. I think just even thinking about schools, I have to go back to the very first thing, which is, for me, I was always inherently aware of my blackness, whether it was my choice or not. You know, and I think the first time was probably when I was in elementary school, and I was coloring with crayons, and I was coloring and talking about how much I loved my skin, my brown skin, this and that, and I was all excited. I've always been a very loud, bossy person.
We love loud little girls.
And my teacher came up to me and said, you know, you're coloring with the brown, but you know you're black, right? There's a moment, you know, when you're that young, where I was looking at the color of the crayons, and I said, but this is the color that I am. And you're telling me I'm the color of this. And I thought she was saying I'm the color of a black marker, a Sharpie, construction paper, you know. So I bust out in tears. And I remember having this conversation with my mom and trying to understand the intricacies of what blackness was. And even why the teacher in that moment felt the need to stop my black joy, as if it was offensive to her and her whiteness. And I think that that's always something that's always been pushed on me. And then I think in high school, I was the only black person in my high school class, and I grew up in the Bay Area, which is the melting pot, and everyone talks about the diversity of of the communities of the Bay Area, but it's not black anymore. And I was the only black person in my high school class, and I had a teacher that did an activity called the First Response Activity. And so First Response Activity goes by putting up every race on a wall on a piece of paper. We're in a chapel. And so we have one piece of paper that says black, one piece of paper that says Latinos, one piece of paper that says Native Americans. She asked all the students to go around and write down on Post-it notes what their first ideas are, what they first think of when they think of that race. Being my bossy self, I raise my hand, I say, so I just don't think this is a good idea.
I love it. You were being honest. Thank you.
I want to trust the process, and you as the teacher, just don't think this is going to go well. She's like, just, you know, open your heart, you know, to the process. Okay. So we're doing this. You know, I put up my pieces of paper. You know, I'm excited again, like I was with my brown skin, and putting up all these things, you know, thinking of my mother, my grandmother, actually. I carry a picture of my grandmother with me at all times. And then at the end of the activity, she says, okay, go to the one you most identify with, or the culture that represents you. And I want you to have a discussion with the other people in the group about the things on your piece of paper. Raise my hand again. So, I hate to state the obvious, but I'm the only black person here. So how do you see this as a discussion with myself going? She goes, well, why don't you just self-reflect? So I self-reflected on fried chicken and watermelon and gang members and Ebonics, and self-reflected on things that I didn't see or that I didn't identify with and didn't represent the black people or the brilliance that I knew of my own community. And I ended up leaving the room and leaving the activity, and got a Saturday detention for leaving the activity. Then I went to college. So the first person in my family to go to college. And I thought that, you know, I was prepared for college. I watched School Days. I watched Good Will Hunting. I'd done all the research.
I love it.
I was like, I'm ready for these, like, amazing discussions that are going to happen, and sat in rooms with people who said that people that committed crimes were trash and they didn't want to be, you know, dealing with those type of people in their lives. And I was trying to be a lawyer because I thought that's what you were supposed to do when you went to college. You had to be a doctor or a lawyer or like an engineer. So I was like, I'm going to be a lawyer. I was frustrated and I was angry most of the time. And I had a professor that stopped me and said, Jessica, you don't want to be a lawyer. You care about justice. You care about people and what's right for people, so you don't want to be a lawyer. So I then focused on organizing campaigns and actually started with labor campaigns. Worked on my first campaign to kick Sodexo out of my dining hall on campus. And so we kicked them out, ended a multi-million-dollar campaign, brought all the dining hall services in-house, and then worked to unionize the workers with a local of AFSCME over the next year. And so for me, I was like, wow, this is real work that actually impacts real people, and this is what I'm supposed to do. And so it was at that point that I made kind of a transition from just an awareness of my blackness to actually action, because awareness absent action isn't really helpful. And I've been professionally doing that type of work. I worked with the NAACP because I was like, I care about black people. That's where you go. You go to the NAACP, here. You know, ended up at the Kathy Cohen put together the meeting, first meeting of BYP 100. We didn't know what we were at the time. You know, we tell the story as if it was super professional and planned. But we're in this meeting. It's like 100 random young black people. They put us in these like limos, and we're going to this secret location. I'm like, where are we going? They're going to kill us. That's what I'm telling them. They're going to kill us. They found us all. They're going to kill us. And, you know, so I'm trying to stay on my phone like, I don't know where we're going. And we get there, and it just so happened that at the end of the second day we were meeting was the day that the verdict came out in the Zimmerman trial. And in that moment, you know, we were supposed to be answering the question of if we needed an organization to represent black young people in this country, and if so, what would that look like? And in that moment, we began to answer the question that we were set to answer in discussions through action. So, you know, we had people that took to the streets of Chicago and were literally organizing with folks on the South Side. We had people who started creating a public statement about what black young people really needed. We had people who started talking about, well, what do we do around policy? We had folks who wanted to cry, who wanted to laugh, who wanted to yell, who wanted to talk about the fact that black people never have a space to heal. You know, we had in that moment an organization and literally overnight became Black Youth Project 100. So that's really how I've charted my path to this moment.
Thank you. Thank you. Good. So we have about a half an hour for our discussion before we open it up to Q&A. And I'd asked you before to think about one word that could help launch our discussion. And I heard some words that I would pick out of what you already said. Clay started us off in talking about post-'60s civil rights legislation, and there's certain complacency that set in. That's an interesting word. But I'm wondering if you all would say your word. Don't say why you chose it. Just let's get all the words on the table, and then let's have a conversation. And the question is, of course, you know, what word do you think captures an important theme in the black freedom struggle over the past half century, right? Or now? I mean, a word that you feel is an important one for us to wrestle with as we try to understand this moment, how we arrived at this moment over the last half century.
Want me to start?
Yes. So one is a big question for one word answer. Blackness. Okay.
Progress.
Progress. No question mark, just progress?
Oh, it's definitely.
Okay.
You know,
I'm editorializing.
Big one, that's all right.
Their words.
Oh, this one word thing is really hard. I have 5, but anyway, I'm going to say grassroots.
So you ask academics to give you just one word. Yeah. Or organizers, right? Yeah.
I would say struggle, but to put it into context.
No.
Just one word, please.
Yeah. Well, what I mean by that is that I've been carrying on this long argument about using some term other than civil rights movement.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And because for my students, if you say the word civil rights or the phrase civil rights movement, it automatically back in civil rights days. Mm-hmm. It's something that happened in the past that doesn't have very much to do. Mm-hmm. And so throughout my career, I think I've been trying to find a way of describing something, you know, a freedom struggle that's ongoing.
Okay.
So, struggle.
So you've jump-started the next part of the conversation, but let's get Terry's word on the table.
My word is enigma.
Enigma.
Okay. Do any of you want to react to or ask a question about a word that's been put? Like you put out blackness. Now, Black Youth Project 100 can wrestle with some blackness, right? Unapologetically black, building black futures. Why did you say blackness?
That's what it's about, to me. That's what the movement was about. That's what our discussions should be about. But I see it, as we said it, that all these connect. All these words connect. Mm-hmm. And they form puzzle pieces, or pieces of the puzzle that we're trying to construct.
Mm-hmm. And you say blackness in terms of embrace, in the way that Jessica talked about it, embracing one's blackness in a sort of white supremacist
it could be
culture.
That. It could be however you feel blackness impacts you. Mm-hmm. To me, blackness is what's the important part of the women's movement, because I could not see myself in the early days of the women's movement until I added the black part to it. So the black women's movement, I thought, was significant. Mm-hmm. Since I could only use one word.
Mm-hmm. But blackness, and I want to ask your responses before we leave this word, it's gotten complicated, right? We have an upsurge in black-led struggle at this moment, which I think is very hopeful. Young people who, and today, by the way, I don't know if people know, May 19th is a day of action at BYP 100 and Black Lives Matter and what are the other, Ferguson Action Network, the Say Her Name campaign about holding up the names of women who've been victims of police violence. But we have this upsurge under our first black president. Right? So blackness is complicated. We have a situation in Baltimore where Freddie Gray is murdered, and several of the culprits who are on trial now are African American police. So it's not. It never was uncomplicated, but it is more complicated today to say blackness, unqualified, right?
No, you qualify it.
Okay. Okay.
To me, that's the noun. You add the adjectives to it.
Okay.
Well, I'm just wondering about the notion that I think you put it, the struggle is about blackness. And one of the things that just came to my mind as I was hearing you say that was King's last book, Where Do We Go From Here? Mm-hmm. And I remember, I think it was Bob Moses who commented on that and said, the problem with that question is, who are we? Mm-hmm. Who is the relevant we? Right. And you have to answer that question before you know where are you going.
You're going, true.
And I think to some degree we got too wrapped up in the question of what is blackness, because it became not just descriptive but proscriptive. That, the blacker than thou kind of attitude, which I think was a very divisive thing, also in the 1960s, as opposed to the way the Black consciousness movement was meant to be a source of inspiration to carry on the struggle. Instead, it became a source of division within the struggle. And I think that that's perhaps one of the things that we haven't really resolved, and it goes beyond the black community. If we are going to change the world, who are we going to change it with? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Who are the relevant allies? Who are the people we are trying to work with and work against?
This discussion we're having right now reminds me of why I chose the word I chose as a one-word response. And more to the point, I was asked recently by a woman in one of my groups, she wanted to know if I would prefer to be called Black or African American. And I looked at her, was respectful, gave her eye contact. And she seemed puzzled. She said, well, aren't you going to answer? I said, well, frankly, I think I need more options. But in her world, I could see that that was it for her. I had been reduced to either one of those categories. Finally, I offered up Terry Roberts. I said, try that one for a while and see how it works.
Good for you.
Say more about why you chose Enigma.
You know, very early in my life, it occurred to me that collectively we seem to be skirting around the issues. Nobody was willing to name the problem or problems. And I thought, okay, there's a fear here, but there's this unspeakable, unspoken, whatever it is, and it presents a big question mark to almost everybody. Nobody really knows. It's as if we're all walking around in a room where the lights have been turned off, and we bump into each other, and we bounce off, much like billiard balls on a table. That's how I see most of life, really. I'm surprised to see any two human beings who can have a conversation together because we're so unique in the universe. And we think so differently. As a psychologist, I use that in my work with couples. I could see this thing is not going to be good, you know. You have two people who have ostensibly chosen the most perfect human being in the world for a mate. And then I knew, from my standpoint, that none of us are perfect. That was one problem. But it's all about that. It's about how we see who we are and know who we are and how we see others. What happens at that intersection of self and other to begin with? Those are the dyads that build eventually the society. We're in trouble in terms of understanding very basic things. We calm ourselves with putting a lot of energy into technology and really pursuing knowledge at some levels, but true knowledge, true understanding of who we are, that's missing, absolutely missing. Well, we make things up.
We what?
We make things up to make it work. We pretend as if we know the truth.
Right. We'll talk about that after. It's a longer conversation.
Yes.
Because I think there's a process of self-discovery as we change, as the society and the world changes and all that. But I'm, in my more optimistic moments, impressed by the ways in which very, very different people come together for struggle, for forging community, for survival, for joy, and all of that. And I've found that most in, not really in the academy as much as in political circles, but among very unlikely cast of characters often.
Well, no, you're right. That actually happens to me too. I bump into people now and again, and those encounters are so profound that I can be sustained for as much as 6 months. As a consequence of having had that encounter.
Okay.
But
I get a little more mileage.
Oh, good. My requirements are so much greater.
It's funny. I mean, they call you an elder, and I just got called a youth elder the other day.
Oh my God!
Back with a question like. But so it was definitely progress with a heavy, bold, underline, italic, and question mark after. I started in this work as an organizer, but now pretty much focus more on systems, infrastructures, trainings, capacity building for Movement for Black Lives work. And so I do a lot of data work. That's the majority of the work that I did when I was at the NAACP. And I just want to give a couple statistics and then kind of explain as to why I did progress. So right now, just very basically, if you look at like population growth, right? And so like, and all these sources are like government sources. I want to be clear that I'm not quoting some random, blog that like my best friend wrote. 'Cause I always get that question. Where'd you get that? From the Census Bureau. So Black population right now, we're about 13.2% of the population. They did 2060 population growth projections. So right now, Black people, 13.2% of the population. 2060, we will be about 14.3% of the population. It's about a 42% population growth increase. The only demographic that is lower than that is people of color, is Native Americans at 41.7%. We have Pacific Islanders, Native Pacific Islanders at 62%, Latinos at 114%,
Surprise.
and Asian Americans at 128%. So it's
The
the base
128% is of
population increase by
That's
2060.
That's surprising.
Right? So that's just the base framework of what we are in existence, the growth, right? But then we know that in terms of life expectancy, Black people have the lowest life expectancy. We know that when we look at any issue, we could look at unemployment, right? We know that unemployment for Black people is about twice what it is for white people, right? Black unemployment is at 11.4%. We look at unemployment statistics for last year, it pretty much was stagnant or went down for most communities. It went up for young Black people over the summer of last year. Black trans people report an income of their households at of about $10,000. 26% of Black people live in poverty right now. I think the scariest piece of that for me is that 46% of Black children under the age of 6 live in poverty. We look at health. You know, we know that more white women will get any form of cancer, but more Black women will die from every form of cancer. We know more Black men will get every form of cancer, but more Black men will die from every form of cancer. We know that the deadliest hate crime in the past 75 years targeting Black people was last year in Charleston. We know we're at the point right now where statistically and mathematically it actually makes sense for us to start comparing police shootings and deaths of Black people to lynching. That makes sense. That's where we're at right now. We know the statistics in 2014 was a Black person was getting killed every 28 hours. If we updated that for 2015, it was every 23 hours. And we say progress and we say improvements. But when I look at the numbers and I hear the stories and I see what's going on, I say progress towards what and on whose scale and for who and for what. Progress within a system that's built in anti-Blackness and built on the backs of Black people doesn't really make sense for me. And I think for us, the progress that we see when we see that without a question mark and with an exclamation point is in looking at what has happened in the past, the work that has happened, the strategies that were implemented, the conversations that were had, and using that to then redefine what progress looks like for us outside of these systems. So for me, it's progress.
So it's really to problematize the notion of progress and to say we have to redefine it. Yeah. And it's always an ebb and flow. Some things move forward. And of course, what you raised too is, brings us to the question of disparity and the range of Black experiences, right? I mean, some Black people are doing better than, one would have projected. And then many, many of our people are in desperate situations where they're living under siege.
Well, I landed there because it seemed to me that while I love Clay's word, because struggle is always there, it's when the grassroots are mobilized, and mobilized is maybe another word, that the movement becomes really powerful. And I feel like I'm mostly a witness, but I grew up in segregation. And I spent time, before I retired, but even since then, particularly since Ferguson, I found myself giving talks wherever I can about the deep, long history of racism, because people either don't know, or I would say we're a society that's really good at forgetting. But I grew up in a world that believed it couldn't change. And I witnessed a revolution. And everything you say is totally true. That revolution is so incomplete that it's actually scary. But there are pieces of it that, you were there as it was happening, that did get defeated And it was the scale of the movement, in part. It was the fact that the people at the bottom began to believe that change was possible.
But isn't that...
And that they could take a risk because people did put their lives, their jobs, their families, everything on the line to get involved.
But isn't that the dilemma, though, is that I think the success of the struggle was to destroy the legal structures of Jim Crow.
Right.
And I think in a broader sense, we got citizenship rights at the same time the rest of the world. You know, one of the things that happened sometime during the 60s, getting into statistics, is that for the first time the majority of humanity were citizens of the country where they happened to be.
Oh, yeah, because
And
colonialism was crumbling all
right.
over the world. That's why I went to Africa,
But
that happen.
my point is not so optimistic about that, because I think that part of what didn't happen
right.
was that human rights didn't happen.
Right.
I mean, if you look at what has happened since, is if anything, we've gone backwards with respect to human rights. And I think that that's one of the things that we became very complacent about with respect to gaining citizenship rights. I mean, if you go around the world today, your human rights are your passport. If you have a good passport, you have human rights. If you don't have one, you don't. And there are lots of people, you know, I was in Zambia for the 50th anniversary of their independence, which happened to coincide with the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act. And one of the ironies was you go to the U.S. Embassy, and this is true in lots of African countries, and you see all the people standing in line trying to get a visa, either to the United States or Europe or one of the countries like that. And the irony of the number of people who died to gain independence, and how many people now would give up that citizenship right in a moment to get a work visa out. And I think that's where we are, is that we've, with respect to the basic notion of human rights, which is written into our Declaration of Independence, you know, all men are created equal and all that kind of stuff. Well, that's not true in the world, and we've gone backwards with respect to that.
And it's not true in some communities in this country, too. And I think that's really an important...
We're part of the world in that respect.
Yeah, but I mean, you know, oftentimes human rights get discussed in global context outside the U.S. and assumed that U.S. citizens have full citizenship rights. And I think what this current movement is showing is, you know, that there's a police state in certain communities, that people don't have mobility, that people don't have certain kinds of rights in this country. And the solidarity delegations that I think BYP and I've gone on to different places around the world, it's been to say, you know, that's an illusion, that there are particularly black communities here that very much resemble those communities in other parts of the world that don't have human rights. And economic justice, we haven't talked about that too much, but we've hinted at it. I mean, the question of economic justice in terms of where the movement, where King left off, where King died, right? With sanitation workers in Memphis. I'm wondering maybe if we can talk about a couple of these themes in our next few minutes, the issue of capitalism and economic justice as it relates to an ongoing black freedom struggle.
I think it's probably an appropriate time to share the wisdom offered by Malcolm X and thinking about these things. You know, I was in Little Rock for one of our 10th year celebrations, and people were so anxious to have the 9 of us support the notion of celebration. I chose not to. In fact, I wrote an op-ed piece entitled "No Time for Celebration." Well, what Malcolm said in regard to that was, if you plunge an 8-inch knife into my back and then you remove it 2 inches and you want to celebrate, we've got a 6-inch misunderstanding.
I love it.
I think we have to be careful about that, because when you see through a clear lens this society, I think everybody is aware. No matter what word games we play, I think people who truly look can see the truth. But we create these linguistic fictions, I think, just to maintain life on any given day. If the truth were in our face 24/7, I don't know if we'd have the stamina to survive. But I think we must strive to get there so we can truly know what we're dealing with, especially for those who come after us, our progeny, those who will carry the banner forward.
Yeah. And I think that that's the thing for us, too, is that we have to get to the point where we're comfortable complicating the conversations and the strategies and our existences that we have, and even just the narratives. BYP 100, we do Black liberation work through a queer feminist lens, right? And so most of the conversations I have are about what that means. And so usually I start talking about things like, looking at the LGBTQ movement and the fact that the narrative that's oversimplified is, marriage equality. Well, how far does marriage equality get you when you can't go to the bathroom in North Carolina? And, it's like, so do you tell me what's more important in this moment? The fact that now women are getting stopped in bathrooms in North Carolina, being questioned and being harassed physically because they're just trying to go to the bathroom. But I have my marriage license and I'm married to my partner, right? Or we look at economic justice issues and we want to boil it down to wage disparity issues between women and men without understanding that people don't have paid sick leave days and need to take days off to take care of their children, because at this point, childcare is more expensive than rent for most people. And if their child is sick, they don't have the luxury of being able to put their children somewhere else, right? So we simplify these narratives and we simplify the movements and we simplify Blackness for the comfort and sake, I think, of people when they sit at the dinner table, instead of understanding that we actually have to do the opposite. Like, we have to have complicated conversations. We have to talk about economic justice and identity politics and race. It's when I go into a room, I'm never just one thing. I would love to just walk in a room and just be like, I'm just going to be Jessica today. I'm not going to be Black. I'm not going to be young. I'm not going to be queer. I'm not going to be any of these things. But you know what? Every single time I walk into the room, I have to carry all of those identities with me. So for you to ask me to sit at a table and not address every single aspect of those issues and talk about how it impacts me every single day is negligent of who I am as a person. It's negligent of our communities and how they experience things. And they experience things differently. When we're talking about economic justice issues, it is different if you are a Black woman. It is different if you are a Black trans person. And so you have to incorporate that into the conversation, which is a lot of also what we put behind Say Her Name. And today is our National Day of Action. I would definitely encourage folks to, if you're on Twitter and you're on social media or just even on Google, just to look up the hashtag Say Her Name. Because what that is it's a day of action to say her name because you don't know those names, right? And that's another simplification of our work. You know who Eric is, you know who Trayvon is, you know who Jordan is, you know who Mike is. But why don't you know who Ayanna is? Why don't you know who Rakia is? And even if you do you really know what happened? Why do we always talk about MLK and Malcolm? I love Malcolm X. I know it's his birthday. I'm so excited. I love it. But I'd like just once to be able to start a conversation framed around Ella Baker. I'd like for once for us to have a conversation about Bayard Rustin,
Right.
We need to talk about the women and the queer folks that helped make this work happen. The majority of the organizations that are part of the Black Lives Matter movement for Black Lives Infrastructure are run by Black queer women. That's no surprise. But that's always been the case. That's probably who's running behind the scenes right now, So I just need folks to get to the point where you're comfortable getting a little dirty, letting it get a little messy, because our everyday lived experiences are already that, and the work should reflect it.
Right. Can I just
Yes.
add to that what I think you're describing is the kind of work that makes a grassroots movement powerful, because you're engaging in organizing, which is capacity building, which is building people's ability to have those conversations. And also to figure out how to act together, how to make each other strong instead of feeling isolated. And it is certainly true that when that legal structure fell down, a lot of people sort of thought, well, that's taken care of. And it was only the beginning of a beginning.
Well, two words. I mean, one is when Clay said struggle, there's struggle in the macro sense, and then there's struggle within movements to find a common ground that we can stand on together, right?
Right.
And that's critically important, and it involves dealing with all the complexities that that Jessica just laid out there.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
I think we have to remember the young people who are coming up, like through elementary school. I'm not talking about teenagers, and the way they perceive not only children of color, but children who are white as well. They, especially since we're now in almost a semi-integrated, a lot of communities have schools that include black and white and Asian children, Latino children too. The community where I live is like that, in Columbia, Maryland. And I raise this question because years ago when my daughter was in maybe second grade, somebody called her black. She said, well, you're black. And she came home and she said, Mommy, why did she call me black? Now, she wasn't angry. She was just confused. She said, she looked at her hand. She said, I'm not black. I said, black is a color, but it has more meaning than just a color. She said, okay. And I said, so she got that, but she still didn't understand what we were saying. I said, now, and I don't know how I got it out, but what I managed to tell her was, some people identify themselves as black, not because they are literally black in color, but that their worldview is about people who are considered black by the larger community.
Black is a political color.
Yes, I didn't say that, but she finally got to that. And it was very interesting how that was an educational point in her life that has meaning still. And I think this is something we need to focus on, too, is how we're going to translate the quote-unquote movement of the past and the movement of now, because there's a movement now, so that very young people will understand it enough so when they reach teenage, they don't have to be educated about it.
And that's the intergenerational work. I mean, one of my questions, which we won't explore here right now, we'll kind of turn it to the audience, but is how we see intergenerational work. The youth movements of the 60s, right? The anti-war movement saw itself as a youth movement. SNCC was a youth organization. Right. But none of these movements were ever without connections to elders and people of other generations. And so how do we see that? And how do we see what the challenge of what you're raising in terms of young people, freedom schools, which we have one in Chicago, of young people trying to, grapple with a different view of the world and themselves as they're emerging.
My name is Logan. I just graduated from I just graduated from graduate school with a master's in public history. Yay! My question is kind of going a little bit into the future. We're currently it's a continuance of the Black freedom struggle, but I kind of see.
Speak right into that mic.
Sorry, the Black Lives. Okay. The Black Lives Matter movement as part of the Black freedom struggle. How do people see in the, say, 10 or 20 years kind of commemorate or kind of remember the Black Lives Matter movement? I kind of see this question, I asked this question because last year we celebrated the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday. And I was at that commemoration. But what the press. So of course, you can't really trust the press at times. I just want to see how the public, or just people or scholars or anyone in general, see or kind of commemorate or remember the Black Lives Matter movement. Thank you.
Depends on how.
Sounds like you do the work.
I mean, I guess the first thing I would say is that I would really hope. So I come from NAACP March organizing, where we do all the national marches, to the point where I wrote an op-ed about why I wouldn't march anymore nationally and why I won't, unless it's somewhere else like that. It's not DC, right? Like if we were doing local marches on our capitals and states, that's quite different. I look at the word commemoration in that same way. I don't ever want to be someone or a movement that is commemorated. I would love us in 10 years to still be collaborating and agitating and organizing. But it's like this, that's still the work, because there's still going to be work in 10 years. So hopefully in 10 years, I'm not the person up here talking about young people, because, you know what I mean? But I've moved to another position in this work, and I really think that that's what it is right now, is we're trying to figure out, even when we think about the intergenerational piece, is that, yes, I work for a Black youth organization, but not just Black youth have a role in the liberation of Black youth. Not just Black people have a role in Black liberation. And I think that that's the thing, is that I hope in 10 years what happens is that people are coming together and figuring out how to continue to strategize so that we can abolish these systems and these infrastructures that are built literally in anti-Blackness. That we're not just trying to pass, reform policy, where people can also just show up and wholly be themselves. And that's a lot of the times of what the work we do as BYP 100 is holding people as whole selves. We ask people how they're doing with the expectation they're going to say, I'm doing fine or good. But can we actually create spaces where people can say, actually, you know what, I'm tired, I'm frustrated, I'm angry. And what does that mean to be held in that way, and to provide spaces where we also heal at the same time as we organize, right? So hopefully in the future there is that space that continues to build, continues to grow, is not funded by foundations. I could continue to dream, but I just hope that in 10 years, hopefully we can be in a space where we're still working together, and that we've won some things, but we've also sustained those things. Because I think that that's the weird place that I'm in right now, is that we're building new campaigns, but a lot of the campaigns we're even building now are trying to restore things that people up here worked to actually fight to get, that then were repealed and taken away.
Yeah, right. Absolutely.
Howdy.
Hi.
I'm Jocelyn Imani.
Hi, Jocelyn.
So I forgot who it was on the panel that made the point about making a distinction between the civil rights movement and the longer freedom struggle, but I see us the same way we misremember the civil rights movement as shorthand for every Black activist thing of that time period. I see us doing the same thing with Black Lives Matter as the catch-all term for anything happening now, or for feminism becoming the catch-all term for anybody who wants to push back. So how do we not make that mistake anymore? How do we stop doing that?
I think one of the things that happens when the closer you are to the inside of a movement, the more you realize that as you're creating a movement, someone else is creating a mythology of the movement.
Right.
And, even as historians and perhaps as museums, we do that all the time, because we create these narratives. I worked on Eyes on the Prize, and so you have this narrative that the movement happened in 6 parts, and so what gets left out of that? What gets left out is that it puts the emphasis on those events that captured the attention of the media. And Barbara Johns, in 1951, when she led a walkout of her high school to protest against poor educational conditions, that was just as audacious as the other teenagers in Greensboro, North Carolina, in 1960, who launched that sit-in movement. Why is one a central part of the narrative of the freedom movement, and the other is, except for my history textbook, largely forgotten? You know, I'm not sure how many people in this room know that Barbara Johns convinced almost her entire student body of a black high school to walk out in protest of conditions in that school. Yeah, and that was ended up as a legal case that became Brown versus Board of Education.
There's hope.
Yep.
Let me just add that. One of my former PhD students is from the county.
Farmville.
Her mother was part of the boycott. Her mother is around my age, but she's still alive. And
You are very much alive. So are you.
what I'm saying is,
And live.
we're in that generation that's dying off, but her mother is still here. She's interested in doing, in fact, she's done some oral histories with the people. So there is a movement going to recapture that, and I'm sure this is true of other movements.
But I guess my larger point is that movement and struggle are things that are going on at all times, in all places.
Yeah.
And the notion that we select out these particular events, even the March on Washington, which obviously was important to me, there were at least a dozen cities that had marches that spring and summer that were not quite that large. But in terms of the movements in those cities were just as important.
That's part of what we do as historians, though, and we have to be careful, is that there's a kind of artificial containment and orderliness about the way that we approach it, right? You have to put it in chapters, you have to have a title on it, and it's all messy and it's all overlapping at the same time. But I also want to speak to Jocelyn's question in another way. Is I think that, for example, Black Lives Matter movement is very distorted. I mean, I thought it was really important that Opal Tometi and Patrisse Cullors and Alicia Garza inserted their names and themselves into the narrative, the origin story of Black Lives Matter as a hashtag and so forth. But it really encompasses dozens of organizations, about 20 national organizations that are doing this work right now, right? Some larger than others. But the way we contain it narrows our sense of what is going on, right? And I think in a certain way de-radicalizes it too. And I think that happens in every period. It happens while the movement is unfolding, the contestation over naming. And then it happens when we do our work as historians.
Yes, I'll be brief. My name is Bill Doggett. I'm from California. I want to address something interesting which speaks to this. My father is the late Reverend John N. Doggett Jr. He was past president of the St. Louis NAACP from 1971 to about 81, but he has a history. He brought to St. Louis in 1965 a history out of Los Angeles, being the treasurer of the Western Christian Leadership Conference, which was the West Coast fundraising arm for the SCLC. My father and my stepmother, Juanita Doggett, were icons, civil rights icons in St. Louis in the late 60s, 70s through the 90s. They both passed away, one in 2010, my father in 2011. My father is buried in St. Peter's Cemetery, the same cemetery in Ferguson that Mike Brown is. And what I want to talk about is that they passed away, had managed in a way to create an artificial or hold an artificial peace, at least in terms of the view of African American St. Louis. But St. Louis then and now, especially in 2014, 15, 16, is really the Birmingham, the Selma, the Montgomery of our times. And the challenge that we see through the trial of Mike Brown was that this concept of self, that white St. Louisans somehow see themselves removed from the experience of what we're talking about, of progress, and they have an idea of themselves and an idea of African Americans. Still, we're seeing that in Ferguson, irrespective of what the findings of Eric Holder were. We're still seeing today that Ferguson and the white power structure are rejecting this progress moving idea of making progress. Instead, they are keeping it. So how do we separate, how do we going forward look at the differentiation of self, of me as a historic, multi-generation, African American person or person of color versus me as I'm come from generations of whiteness in St. Louis, and the St. Louis culture is somehow the civil rights movement missed the St. Louis culture. It's kind of complicated, but I just want to pose that.
And I wonder, is it so unique, though? And I'm not sure of the answer to that.
First of all, I just wanted to make a comment. I'll check my Google, and it's quite fitting. Today is Malcolm X's birthday. He was born May the 19th.
Yeah.
That's Malcolm.
Didn't you mention that?
My question goes to, and I'm not sure if we're going to cover, because as Mr. Bunch said, we can't cover everything. But specifically, I want to get your input on one of the things that Michelle Alexander talks about on her book in The New Jim Crow. And she raises to me a very interesting notion as it relates to struggle and civil rights. So I wanted to piggyback on both of those two notions because, once again, I think it was Frederick Douglass said, where there's no struggle, there's no progress. So the two definitely intersect. But anyway, so Michelle talks about this notion during the civil rights movement of the idea of respectability. She talks about the idea that prior to Rosa Parks, there was another African-American female who was
absolutely
denied, but because she was pregnant, she didn't fit the so-called notion of respectability.
Right.
So from there, so that's I want to see if you all can kind of put your arms around that and kind of speak to that, and also how it relates to the whole mass incarceration thing.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Mitch Kishoon. I'm a historian at Western Michigan University. My question has to do with the comments made by Terry and Jessica that I thought were really interesting. That Terry responded to someone asking if he preferred black or African American with "try Terry," and Jessica made a comment that I can't come in and sit down at the table and just be Jessica. I have all these other identities that inform. And I just found that the juxtaposition of those comments very interesting. And I'm wondering if the two of you or the rest of the panel have thoughts about sort of the conversation that might take place around that difference in response in terms of its implications for understandings of blackness and identity and implications for the ongoing freedom struggle.
I'll be very succinct.
Okay.
Because I do feel that one of the issues we face as a group of people in a society, we have been inundated with all kinds of information that is simply untrue. Mythological stuff. For instance, race itself is mythological, and yet we embrace it. It has more currency now than ever before. The lines seemingly are drawn in much greater bold relief. But until we can recognize and accept difference of any kind, we're in big trouble. So that's what I meant by, not responding to this woman's wanting to categorize me. She perceived herself as being different from me, and I certainly saw her as different from me, but I wasn't willing to put her in some category. Just tell me who you are, and we go from there.
Other thoughts? We had the question about St. Louis and unchanged white culture, about respectability and mass incarceration.
Well, I'm going to speak to the respectability thing.
No, yeah. Briefly. Well, I want to get some other panelists in, and then we'll come back. And then the issue of identity.
So on the respectability piece, so I've read Rosa Parks was actually the field secretary at the time in the state. And so there's actually like writings about what happened at the time in that story. Respectability is just something we just have to dismantle and like stop dealing with at this point, because I think the people that appear to be the most respectable have done the most disrespectful things to people. So honestly, I mean, I'll just be honest. Like you come in the door with a suit, it's just the reality of the situation. So and I think we use that as like a faux measure of like where you should go or who you represent, and it's just another tool to like dismantle people and separate people as opposed to us to actually build together. So that's the only thing I would say on that. And just blackness is not a monolith. Is the thing around the identity of it, and we just need to be comfortable when people don't identify the way we do and just let them identify for themselves how they'd like to identify.
I think respectability has many meanings, and you can look at it from a variety of positions. I like to look at the way Mary Church Terrell from Washington, D.C., whose husband was a judge. She was a principal of a black school. My girl was on the picket line all the time. She was in her 80s, in the 50s, on the picket line in Washington, D.C. And someone raised the question about a respectable woman like you doing that. And she turned it around, you know, and it said it's important for all respectable people to deal with these kinds of issues. So respectability back in the 1950s, back in the 1920s, today is a debatable thing. And it comes up a lot. And part of it, I think, I've come to this conclusion, is a way of putting you down if you rock the boat.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And you know your mother wouldn't like the way you do. You know, it's that kind of thing. And I think we need to reject it.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, around mass incarceration in particular, that part of Michelle Alexander's thesis, borrowed from lots of other people, you know, suggests the ways in which there are certain people who are deemed disposable in our society. If you say someone's a gangbanger, you can write them off, right? If you say somebody is a prostitute, then you can write them off. I mean, there are certain labels that have come into, you know, that are in the lexicon that deem people outside of, even in certain black circles, right? So I think it's a really important point to bring up. So we're going to get the questions of the people who are standing, and then we're going to allow each person, and I'm going to start to be really mean about time.
Thank you. And actually, I think that a lot of my questions will be answered over the weekend because there are a lot of conversations. My name's Carol Brooks, and I'm a graduate student at Goucher College, and I'm actually working on a capstone that deals with intergenerational dialogue. But as it relates to the conference that I found out about, this conference was the National Council on Public History, and their theme was challenging the exclusive past. And I think so much of what our public history that is taught to the younger generations, there's a level of untruthfulness. And so there's a need to kind of retell the stories from the perspectives of those who have been in these situations to reconnect a younger generation. But given the struggle that we're still in today, previous movements, it was easier to amass a large number of people from different ethnicities around a single focus. Now, there are so many issues and so many variables, even with being multicultural. I mean, you accept your blackness, but you may also be looking at other cultural backgrounds.
You're raising some complex things. I'm going to ask you to just distill it a little bit for us to your question.
How do you mobilize masses of people around targeted agendas or targeted issues so that you're addressing multiple people?
And you get a mass movement.
Exactly.
Excellent question. Hard to answer.
Good evening.
Hi.
Thank you for allowing me to speak. I'm going to be quick.
Speak up.
Okay, thank you. My name is Jamie, and I had two comments. One is I'm a black Muslim. Can't change the fact that I'm black. I consider myself black. And I choose to be Muslim. I'm not going to change that. But I choose to voluntarily show that I'm Muslim and I was assaulted by a white female who was clear that it wasn't about me being black, it was about me being Muslim. And the other comment is just saying something about the Say Her Name campaign. I wonder if the reason why we focus today on the black men who are dying at the hands of each other and at the hands of police is because historically, when you look at pictures from the past of lynchings, it's just on appearance heterosexual black men who are hanging from these trees. And so when we come here to the president, we are still seeing that, we focus on that. And now what happened to me and the shift in a lot of black women being assaulted, we're going to have to stop kind of focusing on the past, kind of looking at the present through the past lenses, and kind of come, front and center in the present and just look at what's happening now. And it won't be so hard then for us to say her name.
Thank you.
I have a comment rather than a question, and it may be that I shouldn't actually express it now after your comment about race and mythology. I wanted to say something about mythology, but I do recognize that you mean race as a biological category. But there are all kinds of ways that people think about race that are not related to that. So I just wanted to say that I want us not to dismiss mythology so easily, because societies and civilizations and cultures and have been built on mythology, and it has a purpose. And I know that I'm going a little farther than you. Maybe I think I'm going a little farther than you meant that. But I just really quickly, I just want to. There's this WPA narrative of this former slave whose mother she was actually born in slavery herself, but her mother and her grandmother spent their whole lives as slaves. And her mother told her a story about her grandmother. And she claimed in this story that her grandmother beat 13 Ku Klux Klansmen one after another. And her grandmother
she did that?
Had just had a baby. She had a new baby. And and I think it was just brilliant. I think that her mother telling her that story about her grandmother who could not correct it, who was dead and gone and could not correct it, I think it was brilliant. And it's so big, it really does sort of resonate on the level of mythology. This is not just a lie.
I love it. It's a myth.
This is a myth.
It's a myth.
This is a myth. This is not just a lie. And I think that, I just don't want us to dismiss mythology so easily. That's all.
Good for you. Good for you.
Some myths are empowering and some are not. I love these big, thoughtful questions. They're going to carry us through the next couple of days.
Good evening. My name is Melissa Irby. I'm actually a volunteer, and I have a question from Twitter. But before I do, I was informed to let everyone know a key fob to a Nissan has been found. If anybody has dropped that. And someone left a trench coat upstairs in the lounge, and it is at the security desk. Okay, so on to the Twitter question. This question is from Skylar D. Gordon, and the question is, how important are historians to the Black freedom struggle?
There. We can stay here all night. That's right. Get us going. That's a touchy question in the crowd. I like it.
Very succinct response to one of the questions or comments that were put on the table, or a closing comment that you want to make.
I will take you on. We will talk.
Oh, that's all you're going to say?
That's it.
Oh. Okay. Professor.
Well, I actually think these last few comments tell us why we're here. Because, in a sense, one of the things we have to look at in terms of being a historian and being a museum is how do you decide what belongs inside it? What belongs inside our books? And is there a reason that this is not called the American History Museum? Because, in a sense, if we told the correct story, there wouldn't be a need for a part of the story.
Right.
But I think the question of myth, I meant that in the sense that we all are in the business as historians of creating myths. We're creating stories that we hope are accurate in the sense that we've got our footnotes right, but we know are selective in terms of what our narrative is and what importance we place on certain events rather than others, and why it's important at all. So I think when we look at, here we are going to have a museum of African American life, history and culture, and I'm going to be really interested in the number of mythological things that are going to go into that museum. I hope that everything has a provenance that we can trace, and they are actually artifacts from, and we kind of trust the curators to do that. But I think as we walk through it, we have to ask ourselves, what story are we telling? Because that story of the past is telling us something about our future.
Absolutely. Sarah.
Right. I want to say amen to that. Because the histories that our job in some ways is to keep on complicating the story. Every time it gets simplified and mythologized, and I agree that's not always bad. But some histories are empowering, and some the message is, you could never do that. You could never do that. And we have to be about the business of creating histories that say, you can do that. Because people like you have done that, and we all have shoulders to stand on. Lots and lots and lots of shoulders. Not just giants who we can't imagine ourselves being like. That's our job.
Thank you. Jessica.
So I think, I'm not a historian, if anyone was confused.
History maker.
I'm an organizer.
But you're making history.
Well, there were several questions.
But
You're going to do whatever you want, your closing remarks.
The one in all this is that there is something dangerous, I think, inherently about just telling the truth and telling the real stories of what happens. I think even just the question that was asked about you're being attacked because you're a Muslim. And I think a part of that's because there's been a popular narrative that has been put out that tries to create the face of terrorism and then to associate that with a Muslim identity. When the reality of the situation right now is the most terrorist representative right now, love y'all, is white men right now in this country. And it's not, it's white Christian men who are working class. Those have been the people that have targeted us the most violently, right? But that's not a narrative that fits the popular narrative. The narrative of Claudette Colvin was not a narrative that fit a popular narrative. It is not, the popular narrative is to, again, talk about black men and show faces of black men being lynched, because Black women are fragile, because Black women, because that's not the role that we take. There's a reason why we can talk about Mike Brown and Eric Garner, and those are the stories that continue to have play in the news, because then people want to talk about, well, Mike Brown was a criminal, or he did this, or here's what he did to get killed. Or they want to talk about Eric Garner and how he was confrontational in the conversation, right? But we don't hear about Tamir Rice in the same way, right? It's because what is confrontational about a child playing on a playground? We don't hear about Ayanna Davis because what is confrontational about a young Black girl sleeping in her grandmother's house and getting killed in front of her grandmother, right? That is not something that supports the popular narrative. It is not something that supports the current power structure and the power dynamics, and that's why that's not going to be the narrative that's told, and that's why we have Say Her Name. It's not just because we don't hear the stories, it's because we are inherently telling narratives that take power away from the people. And a part of the work of what we're doing is trying to create narratives and stories and campaigns and organizing infrastructure that represents the narrative of the power, and the power relies in us. And we have to be the people that retell those stories. And that's literally why, even when I do trainings, I always retell the story of Claudette Colvin and Rosa Parks, not just because of Claudette Colvin and the fact that she didn't represent respectability, but because people neglect to understand there was an entire organizing infrastructure that went into building that movement. They targeted the buses because it was the only place that Black people had more economic power. It wasn't just an identity issue, it was an economic campaign. There were organizing infrastructure and meetings that had happened across other cities. There was work that had happened. But that is way too powerful for us to tell other people. And so that is my interest in this moment, no matter what, is making people inherently aware of the own power that we each carry, building that power and then actually alternating and altering the power dynamics, right? Changing the system, abolishing the systems eventually.
Thank you. Building something better.
Bravo. I have a suggestion for historians, whether you're lay or professional, to look for the untold stories. And there are a lot of them out there that you might not even think are relevant. And research them and build upon them and see how they fit within the flow of the movements. And there are multi-movements. There's not just one, there wasn't just one civil rights movement. When I started writing this, I was bringing in 19th century ones. There were 19th century civil rights movements, many of which focused on women's organizations. Look for those. We might know about Prince Hall and his attempt to get the schools of Massachusetts integrated in the 19th century. But we don't know about the women who followed and said, yeah, but you got to put women in the schools too. So you've got to do a little more if we're going to meet the goals that we've already talked about. There's stuff out there that people have not connected to the whole idea of civil rights. And I think that's something all of you should be thinking about.
Thank you. We're over time, so I'm not going to stretch it out. We have to be out of this. I do want to, I neglected earlier to thank our two bloggers, Ray Arsenault of the University of South Florida and Allison Miller of the American Historical Association, both of whom within 24 hours are going to be blogging up a storm about all of the issues that we raised and all of the questions that were posed and maybe not fully answered because of the limits of time and other things. I would just add on this question of the role of historians is, one of the worst things you can call a historian is presentist, right? But in some ways, I do think, like everyone else, we have to be accountable for our work. Many of us love the subjects that we write about, right? But we love them enough to tell our understanding of the truth about them. But I also think we have to be in dialogue beyond our academic communities. We have to be engaged with people who will do something with the history beyond simply sit with it, right? That people will build upon it, the difficult lessons as well as the sort of heroic narratives, because also with the grassroots, celebration of grassroots power and all of that, is also we see a populist movement right now which is relying on grassroots organizing, which is very, very scary to me and really betrays many of the best values of the Black freedom and civil rights movements. And so we have to be careful about the heroic narratives in the same way that we want to be fair to people who are often left out of the story. We'll have some really interesting and provocative conversations in these next couple of days. Hopefully this has started us off and launched those conversations in a way that will be fruitful going forward. And I thank all of you for coming out tonight. And again, thank the organizers and thank this absolutely wonderful panel.